Hello and welcome everyone to the second episode of Briks with Bask. This is the series where we are building Lego sets based off of and inspired by the topics we've covered here on the Common Ascent podcast. This episode, we're building a set based off of episode 60, which is turtles. So we'll be building a set inspired by that. So without further ado, let's jump right in. For this episode, I didn't have to think about what I wanted to build basically at all, because I knew right away that I was going to be building a set for the largest turtle that ever lived, Archelon. Archelon was a marine sea turtle, but not a sea turtle like we have today. It was in a different group. It was in the Protostegidae, so a more basal, meaning closer to the earlier members of turtles. So though it looks almost exactly like modern sea turtles, it is not a true sea turtle. It is a different group. But it was the largest turtle that ever lived, with the biggest members growing up to 15 feet long, so 4.6 meters. That's what I'm using these little minifigures for, is a ruler. If we estimate that each minifigure is close-ish to 6 feet, so somewhere between like 5.5 to 6 feet tall. I always picture minifigures as slightly shorter people. A minifigured size as Archelon should be roughly just slightly shorter than these people. So I'm starting with my outline. This T is going to give my rough shape. Archelon was probably about 6 feet across, considering that its longest ribs were 3.3 feet long. So I'm going to start by trying to get a rough idea of the size of the shell, just to make sure that I like the feel for this size. Give me an idea that I'm working with the right shape, and then I'll keep building from there. Let's go over a few more details about Archelon. Archelon lived in the late Cretaceous between 83 to 72 million years ago. It was found in the western interior Seaway, which was the shallow sea that covered the middle part of North America during the Cretaceous. We talked about that in episode 71 of the podcast. So it would have been sharing that seaway with all sorts of other marine reptiles that were famous from that time, like the mosasaurs and such. This turtle is massive. It is estimated to have weighed between 2 to 3 tons. So truly a huge turtle. And to start off, I'm going to start with the face. So that's what I'm trying to find here. The piece I'm looking at, and why I keep bringing all these claws and hooks and wedges and slopes out, is because Archelon, unlike our sea turtles today, had an incredibly hooked beak, dramatically hooked. Besides the size of its head, its skull looks a lot like a bird of prey. It had a 3-foot skull for the largest members, but it had a very hooked beak that came back into shearing sides. So it has a remarkably predatory face. Now that's not too unusual. All of our sea turtles today, minus the green sea turtle, are carnivorous. They're all predatory. The green sea turtle eats mostly algae and seagrass material, but the rest are hunting crabs very often, and many of them go after jellyfish. So a sea turtle being predatory is not unusual, but this dramatically hooked beak is unusual for what we're familiar with. Now, what Archelon was eating, we're not sure. We do not have stomach contents, at least not from the information I could find. Based off of its skull features, it looks like it had a very powerful bite, and the shearing edge of its beak behind that hook was duller than you would expect for something going after meat, going after soft tissue prey. So it's very likely Archelon was taking on tougher prey, maybe even shelled prey, clams or similar bivalve type creatures, perhaps even ammonites, which were those coil-shelled cephalopods, cousins of squid and octopus that lived during that time. So there's a number of prey items it could have been going after like that, but nothing about that beak would stop it from taking on fish and other larger animals or less armored animals. There's also the potential that it too ate jellyfish, like many modern sea turtles today do. The leatherback sea turtle, our biggest sea turtle today, is almost exclusively a jellyfish eater. But eating jellyfish is actually tough, not because of their stingers, but because jellyfish are almost entirely made of water. they share nearly identical density to water. So trying to swallow jellyfish without swallowing gallons of seawater is actually really difficult, because if you grab a jellyfish in your mouth and then try to push out some of the water, which is what most predators do that can drown, so whales and sea turtles and air-breathing ocean creatures, you grab your prey and then you push the water out of your mouth and swallow the prey. But if you try to push the water out of your mouth, the jellyfish will just come out with the water because it's that soft a body and it flows with the water. So leatherbacks have a throat full of spikes that are pointed backwards toward the stomach. These spikes hold the jellyfish in place while they expel seawater and allow them to slowly swallow the jellyfish down the throat into the stomach. So if Archelon was eating jellyfish, and in any large amount, it probably would have to have a similar structure or something doing a similar job to be able to do that. That we don't know, because that's a soft tissue feature, so it does not fossilize. So we may never know that. And hopefully someday we'll find Archelon with a stomach content and we'll get an idea of what they were eating. I'm trying to figure out the shape of the head here, seeing if I can fill it out. So just trial and error with some pieces. So at this point, I've gotten pretty close to the face I'm going to end up with. I'm not quite happy with it. The mouth is still a little too gargoyle-esque, with the bottom jaw jutting out like that. I'm trying to get the back of the head a bit rounded off. This ends up being pretty close to what I end up with, but still not quite there. It's a little too tall for my liking. The mouth's a little too gaping open. So I end up adjusting that, but we're getting close. Moving on to the neck. Gonna fill it out. Just some round pieces, pretty straightforward. Sea turtles can't retract their neck, and I don't think there's any evidence that Archelon could either. So a pretty standard neck works here. While mentioning the leatherback sea turtle, there are a lot of parallels between Archelon and leatherback. Leatherback is our largest sea turtle nowadays. The largest members of leatherbacks measure between 6 to 7 feet long, so right around 2 meters. And the heaviest members weigh up to 500 to 1,500 pounds, or 250 to 700 kilograms. So pretty big, but half the size, both in weight and length, to Archelon. So Archelon is twice as big as any turtle alive today. But there are some similarities. We will get to these features as we build them later. Based off the skeleton, it looks like Archelon had a leathery shell, just like leatherbacks do. That's why they get their name. They don't have that hard fingernail-like material covering their shell that the rest of sea turtles and other turtles have. They have skin covering it, so it is a much softer shell, so to speak. And it looks like Archelon would have had something similar. They also look like they probably had very large flippers proportionately, which leatherbacks are famous for. They have ridiculously long flippers. They have wing-like flippers. Here I'm really just trying to get the head to fit on the neck better, center it up and have the right shape. So it takes a bit of trial and error to get the right pieces that let me fit this onto the neck. And it actually took me a while to get this fit right, but I cut it down. This is the head I end up settling with, so now we've got a face that I'm happy with. So now I'm going to start coloring it, and this is also important, just for some behind the scenes of how I build Legos. This is going to decide the color palette for the rest of the build. I've got something that is the shape I like. I don't want to adjust any of the pieces, so I'm going to stick with these pieces, and the colors that they're available in will partially decide what colors I can build this set in. I figure going with a dark bluish is going to be good. That's kind of a similar color to leatherbacks, which are black to gray. And it also matched a number of the paleo arts I found for Archelon, so it seemed like a good color to go with. This is always a tricky part of Lego builds, is when you find that the piece you want to use doesn't come in the color you want to use it in. So recoloring is something that I do quite often when designing Lego builds. And I just try to find the closest color I can, and sometimes have to find a new piece. And now from here, we can start building up the body off of the head. I'm still going to be using my guide as a rough outline. I'm going to start with the flippers to a degree, so that's what those ball joints are becoming. And this is mainly because I want this figure to be posable, so getting the neck on a ball joint and getting these flippers on ball joints is really important to me, because if I can't pose a build, then I don't really care about it. The flippers of Archelon were very large. They are very broad. Flipper to flipper, the wingspan, so to speak, of Archelon for the largest specimens was 4 meters or 13 feet across. So it had quite the wingspan. The ratios in the arm bones, so the humerus and hand bones, the ratio between them suggests that it probably didn't have particularly powerful flippers in this regard, that it was not able to produce strong strokes for long periods. So it has big flippers, but not particularly powerful. So that's something that sets it apart from the leatherback. They have big flippers, but the leatherback's flippers are very powerful. They are very long, like an albatross's wing. So they are open ocean turtles. Leatherbacks are famous for traveling long distances across the ocean, using those dramatic flippers to make efficient voyages. Archelon doesn't seem like it was probably doing that as much, so it's very likely that Archelon was probably not going out into the open ocean as much, maybe staying in shallower waters, even maybe staying toward the sea floor more often, which is not uncommon for species of sea turtle today. Once again, green sea turtles famously feed on the seafloor as they eat plant material, so they are not needing to swim out in the open water as much unless they're traveling and migrating. So not uncommon, but notable that Archelon probably wasn't a ocean voyager as much as it was a shallow ocean animal, which also makes sense since it was in the Western Interior Seaway, which was a very shallow sea. So quite fitting that it would have been adapted for shallower waters. So I'm giving it a broad flipper here, but not a long one. So I wanted to have, big front flippers to a degree, but I don't want it to have particularly long ones. All that being said about its flippers, there are some other ratios that might suggest some other things about its lifestyle. The large flipper to carapace ratio, so the size of its flippers to the size of its shell, have a similar proportion to things like the loggerhead sea turtle today, which is notably our most predatory sea turtle in that it is pursuing prey. It is a crab specialist, has a big head, loggerhead, for crushing hard-shelled prey. The fact that it has similar proportions to Archelon might suggest that Archelon was able to be a pursuit predator, swimming after prey, actively hunting it down. Probably not able to sustain high speeds, but able to sustain a pursuit. So it probably was a good swimmer. I mean, it would have been a better swimmer than any of us because it's built for the ocean, but probably a decent swimmer. Maybe not as common in the open ocean, though there's nothing that suggests it couldn't have moved out into open waters, but probably better in shallow waters, probably better in potentially chasing after prey or hunting down prey. And that going with the beak makes a lot of sense. I thought I might try to add some more details and decorations to the flippers, so that they're not just fully flat pieces, but ultimately I think flat works here. Their flippers are not particularly complicated structures, so just a big old paddle kind of does the job. Adding some gray speckles just to give it some detail, and so it's not just one flat color. And so those are looking pretty good, and I can start moving on to the rest of the turtle. So now I'm starting to put together the shell, and I'm just trying to find some large pieces to see if those fit. These slopes look like they might. Starting out with large pieces is always nice because it just gets the build going quicker, and this honestly is pretty perfect. I love the shape. I like that it's a bit more streamlined. I like the slight hood at the front of the shells. It's got a similar profile to the leatherback sea turtle, which is a nice touch. You know, a smooth shell. So all in all, pretty happy with that as the first attempt goes. And now just to secure it to the arms. Archelon shell, like I said earlier, was leathery, so it had a skin covering on it. It also seems to have ridges running down the shell, similar to leatherback sea turtles today. The skin of this shell would have been probably very thick, so it still would have been protective, but not hard like typical turtle shells that we think of. Here I'm just trying to get the height of the shell and the fit to the body correct, making sure nothing bumps into each other, you know, there's no collisions, and that it looks right for the profile of the body. So just filling in those gaps bit by bit. Right now I'm trying to find out how to just widen the shell a bit because I didn't quite want it that thin. That felt like the fins were sticking out a bit too far. This feels like it'll be a bit more accurate to the broadness that the skeleton, the fossil of Archelon seemed to have. So hopefully this will be a little bit more accurate to the real animal. And now I'm just having to figure out how to reattach them and now fill in the middle. Another interesting aspect of the shell, and it sounds like the bones in general of Archelon, is that they do show a somewhat spongy material, similar to dolphins and even some ichthyosaurs that we know of. That is likely an adaptation to help reduce weight for such a large animal. It also is potential evidence that it was visiting the open ocean, since many of the animals we see this feature in are ocean-going animals. But it also could just be the fact that this is such a large turtle that it needs extra adaptations to adjust for its weight. So there's a lot of potentially either conflicting evidence or varied evidence as to how ocean-going Archelon was. For the middle of the shell, just some slopes that follow the same contour as the windshields that I used for the sides, or the wedges, I guess they should be called. At this point, I'm pretty happy with the shell, and so now I need to start filling in the internal structure so that it'll be stable, and so that I can start building the rest of the body. One of the other reasons I picked Archelon to build is because I have a soft spot for sea turtles. While I worked at the Florida Aquarium in Tampa, I educated a lot about sea turtles because we had a number of rescue sea turtles at the aquarium. So they were a common topic for a lot of my tours and talks that we gave. We had a couple of green sea turtles, and then I believe one Kemp's sea turtle. And we might have had a loggerhead. I can't remember now. It's been a little bit, but I ended up talking about them quite a lot while I was there. So I've developed a love for sea turtles. They're fascinating animals. And Archelon, being not a modern sea turtle, but being a convergently evolved group, brings up the question of how sea turtle-like was it. Obviously, the shape of Archelon is almost identical to today's sea turtles, But was its behavior the same? Did they reproduce the same way? Sea turtles today famously return to the beaches that they were born at to give birth, to lay their eggs for the next generation. Did Archelon practice similar behaviors? Did it also have annual migrations to the same beaches? Could you find a beach that Archelons were just showing up at in droves? Or is that just a thing our sea turtles do for some reason that their ancestor did, and so they all inherited that behavior? It can make sense to me either way. That behavior is not uncommon for animals in general, so no reason that it couldn't have shown up on its own and been present in Archelon, or be just unique to our turtles today. It also makes sense from the standpoint that if you live in the ocean but you have to reproduce on land, having a beach that is safe for your young, that it will, stay above high tide and it will give the proper conditions, is a really great tool for being able to make sure that your young stay safe. So by that extent, it makes perfect sense that Archelon might have had a similar behavior. But it just brings up all those questions of how similar were these animals? Because they look remarkably similar. It's very much one of those that I would not be surprised if I told someone looking at Archelon that Archelon was not a true sea turtle, but just a turtle in the sea, that they wouldn't believe me. So I'm always fascinated by animals like this to ask those questions of how many of the interesting quirks did you share with each other, and how many things were you different on? Was Archelon weird? Today the leatherback sea turtle is famous for gigantothermy. It's one of the animals used as the example for gigantothermy, which is a concept for a way that large animals can maintain their body heat. Turtles are quote unquote cold-blooded. They are exothermic. They get their body heat from the environment around them, so they usually need to heat up with the sun and similar sources of heat. But that means that things like cold ocean water can be very dangerous for reptiles because it zaps all their heat away and could put them in danger. So how does a reptile survive the cold ocean? Well, one thing is you might need to live in warm water, so that's one option. The other, which the leatherback uses, is to be big. When you are large-bodied, it takes a lot longer for you to cool down. So once they do get up to heat, they stay warm much easier than a smaller turtle would. And so this is a benefit for large, quote-unquote, cold-blooded animals that allows them to survive in colder conditions than you might think possible for them. Archelon lived in the western interior Seaway, which would have been a pretty warm habitat compared to the open ocean. So Archelon may not have had to deal with that and may not have had the same adaptations, like the fatty layer that we see in leatherback sea turtles. Were Archelon leaner turtles, even though they were much bigger? And they probably had to be, because at larger sizes, big animals have to worry about overheating, because now they take so long to cool off, they can overheat very easily. So maybe Archelon had a lot of adaptations for cooling off and would have had to be worried about getting too hot. So there's just a lot of interesting questions that come up with an animal like this that's so similar to animals today, but yet distinctly a different animal, distinctly from a different group. The Protostegidae are not the same as our sea turtles today. We don't have any members alive today. So there's a lot of questions here as to how much was similar and how much was different. With these finishing touches, the general profile of the body is about done. Getting that underside filled in. This is a fun part of the build, going back to the Lego discussion, where I'm having to figure out how to fill in the spaces, so I'm having to take it apart a bit, and it's always a challenge to make sure that you've filled in the inside of a Lego build, because it is so easy to miss a spot on the inside and leave a gap or accidentally leave things not connected. I'm probably filling this in a bit more than it needs to be, but I would prefer to fill it in too much and have it be sturdy than to fill it in not enough and accidentally have a weak point that I missed that is going to fall apart when you try to build it in real life. Eventually, I will make a point to build each of these sets that I've done for this series, so that way we can confirm which ones are well built and which ones might need adjustment. But for now, they will remain digital, and they will just be held together by hopes and prayers. And at this point, I think I've got the back legs about where I like them. They're sticking out a little bit wide, but I adjust that later. So I've got the plastron, which is the bottom part of the shell. The upper part is the carapace. Plastron, satisfactorily built. It might be a little overbuilt, but I think based off the pictures of the fossils, it probably is fine. Sea turtles actually have fairly reduced plastron. They don't have as robust bottom shells as like a lot of land turtles do. This is true for a lot of aquatic turtles. Snapping turtles have very reduced belly shields, and that just makes you more maneuverable. Less of a shield lets you move around more easily. And when you've got a big sharp beak, you don't need to worry about defending yourself as much as other turtles do. So now I need to start working on the back flippers. I'm kind of just getting an idea for how I like the outline right now, and if the flippers move enough for me to be happy with the posing. They're a little limited, but good enough for a pose, I think. So now I need to build the back flippers. These I'm going to make much more simplified compared to the front. This is partially because the back flippers are always smaller, and the shape needs to be different because back flippers on sea turtles are kind of hand-like. They're very flexible, and that's the tool they use to scoop out the nests in which they will bury their eggs. So they have a shovel shape to them, and they can actually create a scoop shape by curling the digits of that flipper, their toes in, to scoop out the sand. And if you ever get to watch a video of them doing this, it is remarkable to see how dexterous their little toesies can be. Now, once again, did Archelon do that? Probably, because I don't know how else a turtle that big would dig a hole, but I don't know. I don't know if there's any evidence for how flexible Archelon's back flippers would be. I'd have to talk to probably someone who is a specialist. I didn't find any research discussing it, so I don't know if they would be capable of that scooping position. But since I don't know, and the only version of a sea turtle back flipper I know is today's, I'm gonna go with that and make the flippers here shaped kinda similar. So this hypothetical version of an Archelon has scoopy back feet as well. I definitely like the look of the flippers brought in a bit. This is much nicer than sticking off the side of the body like they were originally. So this feels more natural for where the back feet should be on the body. So I'm pretty happy with those. Filling in some gaps. So things are just about done. I'm gonna recolor some parts to try to connect the top and bottom shell a bit. Just trying to give it some color variation, break it up. Coloration is always the most intimidating part of a Lego build for me since I am colorblind. I don't always know that the colors I'm picking go well together or look the way I think they look, but I try my best. It's always useful just to trust the color descriptions of the Lego colors. Very handy that they list the colors out and that they are consistent. So I just run with those and trust that they're going to go together if they've got similar color categories in the name. And so now I'm building the last little bit of the turtle, which is the tail, which I think most people get the idea that turtles have itty bitty tails, which is true for females. By and large, as a rule, female turtles have small tails male turtles have much longer tails compared to the female. So right now I'm just trying out different tail shapes. Now, I don't know that we've confirmed whether or not Archelon shared this feature. They probably did, since this is a general turtle feature, not just sea turtles. So very likely the males would have had longer and more robust tails than the females did, but how much so, we don't know. The reason for this is that to mate, the male's tail is where their cloaca is, so that's where their orifice for mating is, and they need to reach around the female shell. So they need to have a larger tail, and it's often more muscular to allow them to flex it and bend it around the female shell. Well, a female just has a tiny tail because they're not needing to reach around anybody's shell. So they just have a smaller tail. Now, I don't know whether this tail would be long enough to make this Archelon a male or a female, so I will let you all decide that. And if you build this set and you decide you want to make sure it's clearly a male or female, you can make it longer or shorter with your own design. For now, that is my finished Archelon. I'm just testing out some of the posing now, getting it a little bit posed and trying to see how much I can actually get it to move. And so all in all, I'm pretty happy with this Archelon. You know, it definitely just looks like a sea turtle at a glance, so most people who see it probably wouldn't realize it's supposed to be an Archelon. But that very hooked beak, the size compared to the minifigure, it is a minifigure scale Archelon. I wanted to have kind of a swimming pose for the final posture, and I think it gets the pose pretty decently. But since it's a swimming animal, the one issue with trying to pose it is that whenever you get a figure of a swimming animal and you try to put it on yourself, it just looks like a beached animal. And so I decided the last thing this needs is a stand. So I'm going to build a stand for this Archelon that will be included in the instructions and hopefully be a nice way for you to be able to display your Archelon. Now, as we said, Archelon lived in the western interior Seaway, which was a shallow sea. Shallow seas are great for ocean life for the main fact that they are shallow enough that sunlight can reach the bottom in most places, which allows plant growth, which allows coral reefs to grow. It allows then animals to live off of those plants and corals. And shallow seas are always more robust in density of life than deeper ocean water typically is. You know, you're going to find denser communities. This is why you find coral reefs along coastlines, because it's shallow enough for them to survive and allows them to photosynthesize with the sunlight. So I'm making a little semi-tropical, you know, the western interior wouldn't have been completely tropical, but I'm trying to make it feel full of life. Sandy bottom, since likely Archelon would have been a shallow water animal. I'm putting a clam there and a sea star, which are some tough prey that maybe Archelon would have been chomping on and hunting. So maybe it's looking for food. And then really the last step is I need to figure out a way to stabilize that base so it's not snapping off constantly. And so a nice slope there will give it some bracketing in the back. And then the last step is I really just need to figure out a way to keep it from pulling up. And if I do say so myself, I'm pretty proud of the solution I come up with. With some clever geometry, I'm able to make a little mound of sand that should hold your base together pretty well. Now, Archelon will pop off the top, but that's the part you'll want to be taking off. He won't be popping off the bottom. So, should be a pretty stable stand. Once again, we won't know until we build in real life and expose it to real-world physics. But there you go. That's my Archelon. There's our build for episode 60, Turtles of the Common Scent Podcast. If you want to check out that episode, you can find the link down in the description to see our discussion about turtles and the evolution of turtles, where Archelon absolutely comes up. If you are interested in building this set, you can find a link down in the description to the Rebrickable page for the podcast, where instructions for the sets that we've been building will be up for free for you all to download if you're interested. You can also order pieces through Rebrickable for the set, so if you're interested in that, feel free to build it. If you do, share pictures. You can post them on our Discord. You can send us them to our email. You'll find links down in the description for all of that. I'd love to see your version of Archelon. If you make any adjustments, please share them. And if you make any improvements, I will absolutely update the files on Rebrickable. And if you make your own Lego turtle build, send them to us. We would love to see what Lego turtles you're inspired to build. But for now, that will wrap up episode 2 of Briks with Bask. So I'll see you all next time for our next build. Bye-bye.